I knew something was deeply wrong the exact second my calendar notification popped up with a mandatory alignment meeting at 9:13 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday. It was not 9 o'clock, not 9:15, but 9:13, a precise and unnatural timestamp engineered by corporate handlers to catch an employee off balance before their morning coffee could kick in. I clicked on the calendar entry and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The invite was sent directly from Chadwick Miller, the Senior Director of Human Resources. The subject line read Operational Alignment Strategy Touchpoint. In the corporate vocabulary of corporate America, that phrase was a euphemism for getting ambushed without warning. When I stepped into conference room B on the fourth floor, the room smelled of fresh carpet adhesive, stale coffee, and calculated betrayal. Chadwick Miller was already seated at the head of the polished oak table, sporting a tailored gray suit and a practiced expression of manufactured empathy. Next to him sat my direct manager, Preston Caldwell. 14 years of my life I had dedicated to building this enterprise system architecture under Preston's supervision, pouring 80 hours a week into major platform migrations, server infrastructure overhauls, and late-night emergency hotfixes. Yet there sat Preston, staring intently at a paper coffee cup as if it held the secret to eternal life, completely incapable of meeting my eyes. Chadwick offered a tight, artificial smile that belonged on a late-night used car commercial. "Grant, thank you for making time on short notice. Please, have a seat." My chair was already pulled out from the table. In corporate human resources protocol, they only pull the chair out for you under 3 specific scenarios: immediate termination, formal performance warning, or corporate execution. Then came the speech. It was the same hollow, rehearsed script delivered by human resource managers across the country. As part of our ongoing commitment to optimizing operational efficiency and streamlining technical overhead, your role as Senior Principal Systems Architect has been identified as redundant within our restructured organizational hierarchy. Translation: they no longer wish to compensate a senior architect with 14 years of equity buildup and senior grade salary. Instead, they had hired 2 junior contractors at half the hourly rate to manage the complex cloud infrastructure I had designed from the ground up. I sat motionless for a moment, waiting for Preston to speak up, to defend the 14 years of sweat equity I had invested into keeping their enterprise systems online through 3 corporate acquisitions. But Preston merely gave a weak, robotic nod, keeping his watery eyes locked onto his coffee cup. Chadwick slid a thick manila folder across the glossy table like a dealer sliding a bad hand at a high-stakes poker game. "Here is your formal separation package, Grant. Inside, you will find the complete terms of your severance agreement, details regarding COBRA medical coverage continuation, and information regarding your final paycheck disbursement. We sincerely appreciate your 14 years of dedicated service to the organization." Appreciate. That word rang in my ears like a rusty bell. 14 years of missed family gatherings, 14 years of weekend emergency calls, and 14 years of building core infrastructure reduced to a single cheap manila folder. I opened my mouth to ask a question regarding the technical transition, but Preston stood up abruptly. "Chadwick will walk you through the exit logistics," Preston muttered, his voice barely audible as he bolted toward the heavy glass door without looking back. He retreated down the hallway like a man fleeing a crime scene. Chadwick stood up and adjusted his silk tie, offering a cool, mechanical half-smile. "I will escort you back to your desk to collect your personal items, Grant. Company policy requires an immediate departure from the premises following notification." They escorted me through the building like a common thief who had been caught stealing office supplies. I walked past the open cubicles where colleagues I had trained for over a decade looked away in uncomfortable silence. I packed my few personal belongings into a small cardboard box, my favorite ceramic mug from the 2014 system deployment, a desk clock gifted by a client, a small cactus plant, and a framed photograph of my golden retriever, Buster. As Chadwick walked me to the heavy glass doors of the lobby, a single thought burned through my mind with searing clarity. They believed they could erase 14 years of architectural contributions with a standard boilerplate severance form and a polite escort to the parking lot. Back inside my quiet apartment, I placed the cardboard box on the kitchen table. Buster trotted over and rested his heavy head on my knee, resting his warm paw against my leg as if he understood the gravity of the morning. I opened the manila folder and inspected the severance offer. The terms were insultingly meager: 3 weeks of base pay, in exchange for signing a sweeping general release form, an aggressive non-disparagement clause, and a full waiver of all future legal claims against the enterprise. 3 weeks of pay for 14 years of loyalty. I sat on the living room floor with a stack of old documents spread around me, blood pounding in my ears. Corporate executives always assume that senior employees will succumb to panic, accept a lowball severance package out of fear, and sign away their rights before consulting legal counsel. But panic eventually gives way to cold, calculating focus. I resolved right then that I would not go quietly into the night. I gathered every piece of paperwork I had ever received from the company, determined to read every single line of print until I found leverage. I spent the next 3 hours sitting on the hardwood floor of my home office, surrounded by stacks of archived tax filings, old performance evaluations, and corporate benefit brochures. Midnight had long passed, but sleep was out of the question. My mind was racing through 14 years of corporate history, searching for anything that HR might have overlooked in their rush to push me out the door. Near the bottom of an accordion file folder, wedged behind an old backup hard drive, I pulled out a faded document. It was my original employment contract, signed on April 11th, 2010, back when the enterprise was still a fast-growing tech firm operating out of a mid-sized office park. The paper felt thick and crisp in my hands. I flipped past the initial base salary provisions, the standard health insurance summaries, and the standard non-disclosure obligations. Then my eyes caught Section 9, titled Executive Equity Incentive Provisions. It was a section I had barely glanced at 14 years ago, assuming it was standard corporate boilerplate. I read the third paragraph line by line. In the event of employee termination by the enterprise without cause, all unvested equity options, restricted stock units, and incentive grants previously issued to employee shall immediately and fully vest as of the effective date of separation. I froze. I reread the sentence 5 times, letting each word sink in like cold water poured on hot steel: termination without cause. When Chadwick Miller handed me the separation packet, he had repeatedly emphasized that my departure had nothing to do with poor performance or misconduct. He had explicitly stated on record that my role was being eliminated due to organizational restructuring and operational redundancy. In employment law, that is the textbook definition of termination without cause. Over my 14 years with the firm, corporate leadership had awarded me multiple annual equity refresher grants as retention incentives. Under normal circumstances, when an employee resigns or gets fired for cause, unvested shares are forfeited back to the company pool. But under the precise language of Section 9, being terminated without cause meant that every single unvested share from my original grant and subsequent refreshers was contractually mandated to vest immediately. HR had handed me a 3-week severance packet, expecting me to sign a full release, completely ignoring the massive equity acceleration clause hiding in my original contract file. They had assumed I was too defeated to check my original paperwork, or too ignorant of corporate legal terminology to understand what I possessed. A sudden surge of adrenaline washed away the fatigue of the night. I took high-resolution photographs of every single page of the 2010 employment agreement. I saved digital backups across 3 secure drives and emailed copies to myself. I did not know the exact dollar value of the unvested shares off the top of my head, but I knew that after 14 years of enterprise growth and recent corporate valuation spikes, those shares represented a substantial fortune. The next morning at 8:30, I scheduled an urgent consultation with Vernon Sharp, a veteran employment litigation attorney whose office was located in a brick building downtown. Vernon Sharp did not maintain a polished corporate office with marble floors or glass partitions. His workspace was crammed with tall oak bookshelves, metal filing cabinets, and stacks of legal briefs. Vernon was a sharp-eyed attorney in his late 50s who spent 30 years taking down corporate bullies on behalf of senior executives. I sat across from his wooden desk and laid out the story, explaining the sudden termination, Chadwick Miller's refusal to negotiate, and the insultingly small 3-week severance offer. Then I slid the original 2010 contract across the desk, pointing directly to Section 9. Vernon pulled out his reading glasses and scanned the document in silence. For 2 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the office was the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the hum of an old desk fan. Slowly, a subtle, cold smile spread across Vernon's face. "Grant," he said, resting his elbows on the desk. "Did Human Resources include any reference to this equity acceleration clause in your severance packet?" "Not a single word," I replied. "They offered 3 weeks of base pay and demanded I sign a full waiver releasing all equity claims." Vernon let out a dry, appreciative chuckle. Chadwick Miller and his corporate legal team just committed a catastrophic blunder by intentionally withholding material information regarding your contractually guaranteed equity vesting and trying to coerce you into signing a release for 3 weeks of pay. They engaged in fraudulent concealment and a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. He leaned back in his leather chair and continued. In corporate law, when an employer attempts to trick an executive into surrendering millions in vested assets for nominal severance, courts treat that as bad faith dealing. They thought you were a passive engineer who would sign whatever folder they pushed across the table. They have no idea what they just walked into. "What is our next move?" I asked. Vernon picked up a pen and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Our next move is to draft a formal legal demand that will make their general counsel drop their morning coffee. We are going to demand full immediate acceleration of every unvested share, plus full accounting of your equity valuation. And if they hesitate for 1 second, we will trigger formal regulatory audits that will jeopardize their entire corporate standing." Over the weekend, Vernon Sharp drafted a surgical legal demand notice that was 24 pages long. It was not merely a polite request for negotiation. It was a comprehensive legal assault designed to strike at the core of corporate vulnerability. The notice cited Section 9 of my signed 2010 contract, explicitly invoking the immediate vesting of all equity grants upon termination without cause. It also cited federal statutory protections under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 regarding proprietary system automation scripts and cloud deployment frameworks I had authored, independently outside my core scope of work, asserting my full intellectual property retention rights over those core modules. Furthermore, Vernon laid out explicit grounds for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent concealment, and bad faith dealing against corporate executive leadership. On Monday morning at 9:09, Vernon transmitted the certified legal notice directly to the personal inboxes of CEO Dwight Kensington, Senior HR Director Chadwick Miller, and the Chief Legal Officer. When you send a high-level legal demand notice of that magnitude to a major enterprise, you do not expect an immediate reply. Corporate legal teams operate like slow-moving battleships, convening emergency risk management sessions, consulting external litigation firms, and auditing financial exposure before uttering a single syllable. Vernon told me to sit tight, turn off push notifications on my phone, and let the corporate executives stew in their own self-created panic. The silence lasted through the morning until 11:45. Then my phone rang with an urgent incoming call. The caller ID displayed the main corporate switchboard. I picked up on the third ring and answered with a calm, measured tone. "Hello, Grant Vance speaking." "Grant, it is Preston," a voice rasped on the line. My former manager sounded breathless, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw panic, confusion, and disbelief. "What in God's name did you send to the chief legal officer this morning?" I took a slow sip of black coffee and leaned back in my desk chair. "I simply had my legal counsel forward my original 2010 employment agreement and equity documentation, Preston." "Is there an issue? An issue?" Preston practically shrieked into the phone receiver. "The executive floor is in complete meltdown. CEO Dwight Kensington called an emergency meeting with General Counsel, Finance, and Chadwick Miller at 10 o'clock. The legal team ran an internal audit of your equity grants over the last 14 years. Do you have any idea what they uncovered?" I remained silent, letting the anxiety build on his end of the line. Preston continued, his voice shaking visibly. Because you were awarded multiple annual equity refreshers as principal systems architect over your 14-year tenure. Your unvested holdings represent 17% of the entire new executive incentive stock option pool. 17%, Grant. Corporate finance was preparing to register that pool for our upcoming private equity expansion and $90 million corporate merger. Now, general counsel says your accelerated equity claim creates an unhedged legal liability that must be formally disclosed to SEC regulators and private equity investors. That sounds like a significant oversight on corporate management's part, I replied flatly. Chadwick is losing his mind, Preston blurted out. He tried to claim to the CEO that the 2010 contract was outdated and replaced by recent boilerplate handbook updates. But general counsel told him in front of the entire executive board that an administrative employee handbook cannot retroactively void an individually signed executive employment agreement. Dwight Kensington slammed his fist on the mahogany table and threatened to fire Chadwick on the spot if this liability gets exposed to outside auditors. I could hear background noise on Preston's end, the faint, frantic chatter of corporate staff rushing through corridors and doors slamming shut. "Grant, please," Preston pleaded, his tone shifting to desperate supplication. "Can we just sit down informally and figure this out? You know me. We worked together for 14 years. If this goes to formal court litigation or regulatory filing, heads are going to roll. My department budget will be frozen, and my own bonus will be wiped out." I narrowed my eyes as I listened to Preston's desperate plea. For 14 years, I had covered for Preston's technical incompetence, stayed up all night, resolving server crashes he caused, and delivered projects that secured his executive bonuses. Yet when Chadwick Miller handed me a 3-week severance folder and escorted me out like a criminal, Preston had refused to look me in the eye. "Preston," I said coldly, "when you stood by and let Chadwick hand me a 3-week severance package for 14 years of hard work, you made it clear that corporate loyalty was a one-way street. You did not care about my financial future when you thought I was powerless and defeated. Now that you realize I hold contractual rights that jeopardize your corporate merger, suddenly you want to talk about our 14-year history. Grant, listen to me." Preston stuttered desperately. "My legal counsel handles all communication regarding this matter, Preston. Do not contact me directly again." I ended the call and blocked his number immediately. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a formal communication from the chief legal officer's executive assistant, requesting a mandatory settlement conference in Executive Conference Room A on Friday morning at 10 o'clock. The email was signed directly by CEO Dwight Kensington himself, indicating that corporate leadership was ready to confront the reality of their mistake. On Friday morning at 5 minutes to 10, Vernon Sharp and I walked through the double doors of Executive Conference Room A on the top floor. The room was vastly different from the dreary Conference Room B, where Chadwick Miller had handed me my termination folder 3 days earlier. Executive Conference Room A featured floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline, a 20-foot polished mahogany table, and state-of-the-art video conferencing displays. Seated along the far side of the table was the entire corporate power structure. CEO Dwight Kensington sat at the center, dressed in an immaculate dark blue suit, his expression a tight mask of controlled frustration. To his left sat Chadwick Miller, looking pale, disheveled, and visibly sweating through his dress shirt collar. To the right sat the chief legal officer and 2 senior corporate litigation attorneys. Surrounded by thick leather binders and open laptops, Vernon Sharp sat down next to me with calm, practiced authority, placing his yellow legal pad and a single paper folder onto the table. No heavy binders, no frantic typing, just quiet confidence born from unassailable legal facts. CEO Dwight Kensington leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. "Grant, Mr. Sharp, thank you for agreeing to meet. Let us be frank. We are all businessmen here, and none of us want to see this situation escalate into prolonged public litigation that benefits no one. We want to resolve this amicably today." Vernon Sharp smiled faintly. "Mr. Kensington, we are here because your Human Resources Department attempted to execute a bad faith termination against my client, intentionally suppressing contractually guaranteed equity rights worth millions of dollars in an attempt to shortchange a 14-year senior architect. The chief legal officer cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Sharp, let us not overstate the situation. While Section 9 of the 2010 agreement contains specific equity language, our position is that subsequent corporate equity, plan revisions, and annual handbook acknowledgments superseded those early provisions. Furthermore, standard severance protocols for organizational restructuring dictate a standardized payout structure. Vernon leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table with deliberate precision. Counselor, save the boilerplate arguments for a court reporter. You know as well as I do that, under established contract law, an administrative employee handbook cannot unilaterally void a signed executive employment contract containing explicit equity acceleration terms upon termination without cause. Furthermore, your attempt to execute a mass redundancy layoff without proper advance statutory notification under 29 U.S.C. Section 2101, commonly known as the Warner Act, exposes your executive board to personal statutory liability for bad faith discharge. The chief legal officer opened his mouth to reply, but CEO Dwight Kensington held up a hand, silencing his legal counsel instantly. He looked at Chadwick Miller with cold disdain before turning back to us. Dwight Kensington turned his sharp gaze directly toward me. Grant, you spent 14 years with this company. You built critical enterprise systems that helped us reach this level of valuation. I acknowledge that the manner of your separation on Tuesday was handled abruptly and improperly by human resources. Chadwick Miller shrank back in his chair, wincing as the CEO delivered that direct public reprimand. Dwight continued. In the interest of maintaining a clean separation and avoiding regulatory complications during our pending merger, the company is prepared to offer you an immediate lump sum cash settlement of $500,000. In exchange, you will sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement, surrender all equity claims under the 2010 contract, and assign all system automation script copyrights to the enterprise. He slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table toward us. $500,000. To an average employee, $500,000 in immediate cash might sound like a massive windfall. But Vernon Sharp and I had already run the precise financial calculations based on recent enterprise share valuation reports. Vernon did not even touch the piece of paper. He turned to me and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. I looked CEO Dwight Kensington straight in the eye. Mr. Kensington, $500,000 represents less than 1/4 of the actual market value of my accelerated equity holdings under Section 9. You are asking me to accept pennies on the dollar and sign a gag order so that your executive team can proceed with a $90 million merger without disclosing your bad faith dealing to private equity investors. My answer is no. Chadwick Miller gasped audibly, his hands shaking. The chief legal officer's jaw tightened in visible frustration. Dwight Kensington's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing to cold slits. Grant, $500,000 in immediate cash is a generous offer to walk away cleanly today. If you reject this settlement, you face years of costly legal arbitration against an enterprise with unlimited corporate legal reserves. Vernon Sharp let out a quiet, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. Mr. Kensington, you seem to believe that time and resources are on your side. Let me disabuse you of that dangerous notion immediately. You have 48 hours before we file formal regulatory disclosures with SEC auditors that will freeze your $90 million merger entirely. Vernon Sharp leaned across the mahogany table. His sharp eyes locked directly onto CEO Dwight Kensington. Mr. Kensington, let me lay out your precise legal reality without any corporate gloss or legal maneuvering. You have exactly 2 options on the table, and both of them require immediate executive authorization for 5 o'clock today. Option 1, Vernon continued, tapping his yellow pad. By 5 o'clock this afternoon, your enterprise will execute a direct bank wire transfer to my client's account in the amount of $2,350,000, representing the exact full market valuation of his contractually accelerated equity under Section 9. This payment will be completely unconditional, without any non-disclosure agreement, without any gag order, and without any surrender of his personal statutory rights. Chadwick Miller looked as though he was about to vomit. The chief legal officer adjusted his collar frantically, staring down at his open laptop screen as if searching for a magical legal exit. Otten 2, Vernon smiled thinly, is that Grant retains his 17% equity stake in your executive stock option pool. He becomes an active, major shareholder of record in this enterprise. As a major shareholder holding 17% of the option pool, Grant will immediately file formal statutory motions, demanding a full independent audit of corporate governance, executive compensation packages, and internal human resource layoff practices. Furthermore, we will submit formal complaints to SEC regulators detailing the deliberate suppression of material equity liabilities during your pending $90 million corporate merger. The conference room fell into dead, suffocating silence. You could hear the faint whir of the air conditioning unit and the heavy breathing of the corporate legal team. CO Dwight Kensington stared at Vernon Sharp for 10 agonizing seconds. Then he slowly turned his head toward his chief legal officer. "Is his legal position sound?" Dwight demanded in a low, dangerous whisper that chilled the room. The chief legal officer swallowed hard, refusing to look the CEO in the eye. "Dwight, if they file formal shareholder inspection motions or notify private equity auditors of an unhedged 17% equity dispute, the underwriters will freeze the $90 million merger pending complete audit clearance. It could delay the transaction by 18 months and cost us tens of millions of dollars in canceled credit lines." Dwight Kensington's face drained of color completely. He slowly turned his cold eyes toward Chadwick Miller. "Chadwick," Dwight said, his voice dripping with ice, "did you personally review Grant's original 2010 employment contract before initiating his termination on Tuesday morning?" I relied on standard human resources separation templates." Chadwick stammered, his voice breaking with visible anxiety. "I assumed all old contracts were superseded by handbook updates." "You assumed," Dwight interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. "You risked a $90 million merger and created a $2 million corporate liability because you were too lazy to read an original employment file. You are relieved of your duties effective immediately, Chadwick. Clean out your desk and leave the building." Chadwick Miller sat frozen in shock, his mouth hanging open as the CEO fired him on the spot in front of the entire executive legal team and staff. Dwight Kensington turned back to Vernon Sharp and me. He pulled a sleek fountain pen from his jacket pocket and signed the executive wire authorization form sitting on the legal folder. "The wire transfer of $2,350,000 will be completed by 4 o'clock. This afternoon," Dwight said quietly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You will receive immediate bank confirmation." "Thank you, Mr. Kensington," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "It was a true pleasure doing business with you." Vernon Sharp packed his yellow legal pad into his leather briefcase, and together we walked out of Executive Conference Room A with our heads held high. As we passed the main lobby, colleagues who had watched me get escorted out with a cardboard box 3 days earlier were now whispering in awe as they saw the CEO himself opening the heavy glass doors for us. At 4:15 that afternoon, I sat on my living room couch with Buster resting his warm head beside my leg. My laptop screen refreshed, displaying a new notification from my bank. The wire transfer had cleared into my account. $2,350,000, fully liquid, completely unconditional, and free of any corporate gag order. I stared at the bank balance for a long moment as the reality settled in. This money was not just a financial victory, it was complete vindication after 14 years of unappreciated dedication, 14 years of hard work, late nights, and corporate dedication had almost been stolen by a smug HR director, armed with a standard 3-week severance folder. But by knowing my contractual rights, refusing to succumb to corporate intimidation, and holding corporate leadership accountable under the law, I turned an unlawful firing into complete financial independence and lasting justice. I closed the laptop, stroked Buster's soft ears, and smiled. Corporate America had tried to erase me, but in the end, they paid every single penny they owed, proving that no corporate entity is above the law when you have the courage to fight back.